Is North Korea willing to do a destructive attack? Yes. We saw it with the Sony stuff. We saw it with the Dark Soul stuff coming out of Andariel. We do know that if it push comes to shove, will they break something for even something as a small, quote unquote, small infraction like, insulting the leader? Yes. We have that confirmed. Okay, good. Now we know that. Do they have placement and access into places where if they did a destructive attack, it would be critical? Yes, we know that IT workers are a insider threat, and we know that they're aiming to get in places, Fortune 500 companies, anyone that they can place, that they can be good.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Luke McNamara. Today, we are going to discuss something that is becoming a bit of an emerging threat across the North Korean threat landscape. And I have here my guest today, Michael Barnhart, to help unpack that. I think maybe to give a little bit of context before we get into this discussion, and Barney, great to have you here, as always. But this is a threat that, when we think about sort of the traditional threats that we see here at Mandiant and Google that we were responding to or observing, you have your more traditional intrusion-based threats, right? Stuff that we see in cybercrime and nation-state APT activity week to week. This is a little bit different, and this is a little bit more similar to an insider threat, almost. But here to unpack that today, the topic of the North Korean IT workers. Barney, let's jump right into it. Who or what are the DPRK IT workers?
I think as kind of a general thing and kind of what we've called them in the past. So the IT workers are going to be kind of more of they're not APT operators, which we'll touch on. They're not APT operators, but they're hired IT workers. They're hired software services, things like that are coming out of North Korea. And what they do is that you're going to see them kind of forward deployed into various parts, usually outside the country, like a lot of the cyber activities are. Your Cambodia, China, Russia, Vietnam, Laos, places like that. And what they're going to do is try to use that historically that legitimate, and I put that in air quotes, legitimate forms of revenue generation. And as we've seen with UN and a lot of the government reporting, that stuff is going back to fund the missile programs. And I think, again, whenever it was just kind of IT workers and IT services that we were focusing on in the legitimate, again, air quotes there, it was something that was paying attention to. But as we start to develop the problem set and dive in more and really kind of expand on it, we're seeing that the IT workers are actually much, much more complicated and dangerous at times from what we're seeing. So that's kind of them in a nutshell historically.
So for folks to kind of put this in context with the other parts of North Korea's cyber operations and apparatus, and I would recommend folks go check out both the podcasts that we did with Barney last year around APT 43, as well as I think the previous one you did with Eli, again, discussing sort of the North Korean structure of their cyber operations in the various groups. This group is not carrying out your traditional intrusion-based operations with spear phishing or credential collection or things of that nature. These are actual IT workers who go get jobs at organizations and then, potentially leverage that access as a sort of insider threat to follow-on operations. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's interesting too because it's the cyber aspect. Because if we're really just talking about front companies operated by North Korea, that's something that we've always seen, and something we even continue to see in some of our initial IT worker things, where you have them knocking off major clothing lines and doing counterfeit products there to operate through front companies local in North Korea and the surrounding countries. This is going to be the same type of operation, but only for what you would consider as your IT and your kind of consulting and your app developer, that type of realm. But it's just the newer iteration, the cyber iteration, because I mean, these are the same guys that were running, fake pharmaceuticals and fake cigarettes in the early 90s and stuff like that. This is just this is the cyber arm of that.
Walk us through kind of that process, by which these, you mentioned they're kind of usually forward deployed outside of North Korea itself. What is that process by which they go, gain employment at a tech company doing this sort of work?
Yeah, not just the gaining the employment there, but also how they're even selected. You have a lot of these schools inside the country. These are the same schools that these APT operators are going to be coming out of. Your major universities there. You're going to also have the same guys getting the same training for the IT workers, and that type of historical network. Those just because you don't operate on the same way now. You still know those people from back in school, so you still might talk to them, and that's something you kind of keep in mind for them. The how they're operating and there are different levels, and that's something that we're seeing too. Because as you kind of started off, Luke, these are traditional things. They're kind of doing seemingly legitimate work, quote unquote. But there is some maliciousness that we're seeing, and some stuff that we're diving into that actually might kind of go far from that. So, but how it's starting is how like something getting on a job platform, getting on one of the major job sites to get type of freelance work. From there, you're going to get picked up. You're going to be looking for certain things. Again, there's a lot of these resumes and a lot of how they're things that they're looking for. It's very easy to even catch a lot of the lower level ones that even if you wanted to, if you went on to one of these sites that are looking for work and you put out that you're looking for a crypto app developer or some type of these buzzwords for, especially with crypto and blockchain, you're going to get, a couple of resumes from a guy that is going to claim to be coming from Hong Kong with a bunch of work experience in New York and applying for a third party, some type of consulting service that might hire and send its workforce in Europe. So when you start factoring those things, that obviously shows how complex this problem is. But once they're in, then they're going to do legitimate work, quote unquote. They're going to do all that work and try to do what they can to get money back. Now, there are fractions. We are able to see and work with some of our partners, which is a good note. This is a collaborative thing. Again, this isn't just cyber. This is, you have human, you have partnerships that everyone has different pieces of the puzzle. So one thing that we have that's really great over on our side with Mandiant is that we have so many different avenues to gain information and so many partners that we're working with and people that we're able to see a lot of the pieces to form the full picture. And in doing so, like, you have to get X amount of money a month, and you get to keep a fraction of it, and the rest has to go back home. And you keep such a small fraction of it. Funnily enough, is this a lot of times you'll see them all stuck in one apartment, like 10 people in one apartment. It's because their portion of the pie is so much more smaller than what you have to send back to the to North Korea. But that's kind of the operating scheme. You go, you might pay off some people to actually purchase their profile on a platform to get operating there. We've seen some where like we've seen some of the recent open source reporting. You have people keeping laptops turned on inside their house, and then the North Koreans will remote into that so that they can operate for all these IT working companies. So that's kind of the basis and how they're doing it. But the main thing for them is to send the money, majority of it, back to North Korea to fund the program. But the problem is that we're starting to see sometimes APT and malicious activities too, which create a much, much bigger problem.
So we're going to touch on the overlaps with some of the North Korean APT groups, but just to linger on this point a little bit more. So similar kind of function to how we suspect or know aspects of the North Korean groups engaged in cybercrime for revenue generation for the state, where they have to, maybe some of that they're able to keep, but a lot of that is going back to, has been stated by the UN and other government bodies, probably funding their weapons program, their nuclear weapons program. For these individuals who have maybe these skill sets because they went to a technical university, and they're now again working maybe independently or part of a front company trying to acquire work, they're using job platforms, they're using sort of freelancer sites as a way to gain employment. Are there certain types of companies that we're seeing, through our work with partners and others, we're seeing maybe a higher focus? You mentioned crypto earlier. Are there types of organizations that they seem to be trying to get access to more so than others?
Yeah, I think there are different flavors, and it is interesting because I've noticed too in working with some of our partners that different locations might be indicative of some of the work they're looking to. Like what you see coming out of Vietnam, you see a lot of CAD renderings. You see a lot of stuff dealing like with architectural and graphic design, that type of work. Whereas like your China, you might see more of your apps. You might see more of your gaming, your visual stuff, the graphics in that realm. So there are different ones. I think any type of situation where you need to build something on your back end, where you need that type of software and your engineering, that has been one. But really, just anytime you can consider, every company has an IT like support. So really, it kind of opens up. And I don't want to get too diving into some of the specific victims, but we've seen them all the way from the defense industrial type all the way down to the mom and pop, I'm here to make a sticker for your, it couldn't be more wide ranging. As long as there's a way that you can perform IT services and support to an element, then there's going to be some type of play there, as is with any of the things. This is just, the cyber one, the knockoff purses and stuff that you might buy from XYZ country. I mean, we've seen North Korea, producing those too. It's just the different flavor of what they're doing with it right now.
So there seems to be a bit of a co-location based on skill sets for the types of work that these IT workers are engaged in. And, from what we've seen, and again, some of the work with our other partners and what we understand about the nature of what they seem to be doing, it seems like first and foremost, the intent is revenue generation. And so I guess in that particular case, you wouldn't necessarily be picky as to what type of organization you join. But another aspect of this, and maybe this is where we can start to delve into how enterprises should think about risk, is that the nature of some of these companies, certainly you think of something like a defense industrial base entity. Well, if you've got a North Korean IT worker who's now been hired and is some access to your environment because of the work that they are contracted out to do, that poses a certain level of risk, right? And beyond maybe their particular mission and mandate right now is purely revenue generation, and they're there to do that work that they're being paid for. But you also have to think about that, it seems like, as an insider threat risk.
On that same note too, we never got confirmation on this, but I always thought this was worth mentioning. One of the when working with one of our partners, we watched this one highly assessed IT worker. They worked for a facial recognition type of effort that was going on. Some of these startups and stuff like that. It's all going on. But anywho, the main company was the one that was doing all the work, but they had, hey, we have some issues on our back end with whatever SQL database or whatever things that they were working on their end. And unknowing, they had reached out to a company. That company was legitimate, but within that legitimate company was an IT worker. And then again, they did the work, everything was done. And then sometime later, the major company, the bigger one, it had like there was something that happened on its back end. You always remember, like we'd always hear like there's for a while there, we could not get away from like the S3 buckets being like misconfigured, and then everything was being leaked out. Like something similar had happened to that major company, which was dealing with like kind of like big players and very, very important, moving parts in the facial recognition game. They get something like that, and you kind of wonder, you're like, hey, this was literally the job that the IT worker was paid to do, months, year after the fact, it comes to find out there's a misconfiguration, there's a major data leak, things like that, where it's, where you have that plausible deniability. Hey, I didn't do it. I either opened the door for one of my APT buddies, or I did this, or I'm, like you said, with something like like a defense industrial based company, you're looking for, you're looking for, and we see this a lot too, where it's not the company that's the issue. They're not going to hire them. And it's not even, it's the secondary companies that you're hiring as like support. Have they vetted? Have they made sure that everyone on their workforce is doing that? And that's mentioned. It's not an easy task. Like we said, these guys they're coming out of XYZ country, or sometimes North Korea. There's been times where the IP space comes straight out of North Korea, pretending to be someone from one country, operating as a consulting firm in another country that's being hired to do work in another country. Like, I get why it is complicated, and I do think that they definitely use that to their advantage.
So there's an opportunistic threat or an opportunistic risk that's sort of posed by these organizations, or these actors rather, that organizations need to be cognizant of. So It may be that their intent isn't necessarily to directly gain access to an entity that they want to compromise or leverage or target in some way. But if they are being hired, for maybe a subcontractor of that's doing work for a larger enterprise or company, and they, achieve opportunistic access, that risk now is something that they could leverage. That access is something they could leverage down the road.
Absolutely. And you got to start in compounding that with, defenders in these companies that are like wanting to vet for this type of process. You're looking, you're like, okay, I got to start, updating my KYC, my know your customer stuff. I got to do this. I've got to get them on camera, and as those things like that develop, then you have the same developments on what we're seeing on some of the underground networks where like, hey, $5 and I'll be able to do this, or I'll be able to deep fake videos. We've heard, again, it's not, to preface it, it's not our data, it's not our information, but working with some of our partners, we've seen the use of deepfakes on some of these things. They've seen, but like we're hearing more and more about it. So, as a defender's like, okay, I got to do this and this and this, they're on their end looking for ways to bypass all those same mechanisms that we're trying to set up.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine there would be a lot of effort around forged identities and other things to get around KYC in the hiring process. And you think also about just for maybe smaller startups, and they're looking for someone to come in as a temporary contractor to do kind of a sprint of engineering effort, right? They may be looking at these freelance sites, and they may be hiring someone who fits this profile and is actually a North Korean IT worker. One thing we mentioned here, and I think is worth delving into a little bit more, because this is, I think, where it also starts to get really interesting. I think, excellent point you made at the beginning, that this is something you should look at historically in concert with all the other things that the North Korean state has done to bring in illicit finance or carry out endeavors to bring in money to the state, even down to running restaurants abroad, right? You're smuggling, all the sort of, illicit financial activities they've been engaged in. So you can look at the activity from that standpoint, and this is just a pure revenue generation play. But I think the other piece where this really starts to get interesting is the overlaps with some of the APT activity and actors that we know about. So break that down for us a little bit. What does that look like? What are the indications that we've seen where there is some potential like overlap? You mentioned coming out of the same universities in some respects, but where's that sort of overlap with your traditional intrusion-based cyber threats from North Korea?
Well, so it all kind of started with some of the government reporting how they had started mentioning how some of the IT workers were conducting malicious attacks. And that's good to know, because I think you got to step back now and look at, okay, so, this open source reporting and this government publications talking about how IT workers are doing that. Okay, then we should keep that in mind. Now, how does that apply to the larger set? Well, is North Korea willing to do a destructive attack? Yes. We saw it with the Sony stuff. We saw it with the Dark Soul stuff coming out of Andariel. We do know that if it push comes to shove, will they break something? Will they break something for even something as a small, quote unquote, small infraction like, insulting the leader? Yes, we have that confirmed. Okay, good. Now we know that. Do they have placement and access into places where if they did a destructive attack, it would be critical? Yes, we know that IT workers are a insider threat, and we know that they're aiming to get in places, Fortune 500 companies, anyone that they can place, that they can be. Good. Okay, so we know that they will do destructive attacks. We know they have the placement access to conduct a one that's effective. And we now know that IT workers are conducting malicious attacks or are working, we're starting to see more APT overlaps. So now, like for us over here on our team, we're going, okay, this isn't just a player we need to pay attention to. This is one we're in peacetime relatively. We're in peacetime, so nothing bad's happening yet. But if, it hits the fan, this could get really bad really fast. So that's why we want to do that. So then we started looking at some of the actor overlaps. We have many, many different sources of intel on the IT workers right now. Now we have such an abundance that was either passed or obtained or working with, that we're now going, okay, we need to go back to the well. We then started pulling up old APT 43 information. Like, okay, I'm looking at this new work. Boy, it really matches some of the personas we're seeing, some of the naming conventions, some of the, there's times when I had some personas and stuff that I'm looking with APT43, and even some of the crypto clusters that we're seeing with the revenue generation out of like UNC 3782. I've been working with that, and now with all this new information, I want to go back 4 or 5 years and look at all my old notes, and I'm starting to see overlaps with some type of these conventions with the Andariel intrusion set. We're starting to see some type of links with APT 43. I'm starting to see a bunch of links with some of my UNC 3782 stuff, which is the crypto fin revenue generation kind of arm right now we're seeing with APT 43. Well, with personas, I don't want to say the specific personas because we're still investigating. Also, we have just a lot more to go. But from our initial discussions and initial kind of sometimes the same aliases are being passed around, sometimes the same naming schemes, sometimes the same. We're seeing at times, as we've seen even like with the usage of star, it's very open on that on a lot of the public reporting, and then even some of our reporting that we've done on internally on IT workers, and then also it's a big thing that we're seeing inside the APT43 stuff. So like if you have a certain name or a certain way you're going about something, tacking on an identifier on the beginning or ending of their name will then highlight to the others that might also be in the on the same objective or in the same environment, hey, this is me, I'm this guy at this time. Because again, you got to go back to, they're all not co-located. So whenever you are all doing your same IT work stuff and you might have an APT operator in there, you need to be able to identify who that one is and maybe either steer clear or work with or just know who's who in zoo. And now seeing all this new information and getting all these new insights, it is allowing us to go back and draw many, many different correlations. And again, we're in the early stages of it now, but it seems to be making a lot of waves. And so much so, I'll say right now, UNC 3782, that is an UNC that we're seeing do a lot of crypto effort, a lot of drainer activity. I know that you've been watching it in the channels too. I've seen you active in there. It won't surprise me that by the end of the year, maybe next year, we will at some point start drawing UNCs that we're tying to APT 43 like we are right now with 3782. We're seeing that as the crypto arm. It would not surprise me if next year we're saying, oh, that's the IT workers that are actually attached to this APT, because we're seeing so many connective tissues, and we're starting to really dive into that and develop it.
So break this down a little bit further. From what we understand about this now, does it point to that there's, similar, maybe overlapping skill sets and capabilities with some of these individuals coming out of the same training, at least at the university level? Sometimes the mission and focus of those groups is they're being tasked to go obtain a job, right, with that skill set. Other times they are now being part of, one of the units that make up these different clusters that we track. Is the theory that some of these are kind of co-located within the same group, or they're handing off one to the other, or someone is working, in carrying out spear phishing or other components of the malicious activity, one day, and then maybe is being reassigned as an IT worker? What's that when we talk about sort of the overlap of personas and personas that we've linked to actors within an APT or UNC cluster that we suspect to be an APT, and then we see that tied to maybe some of the personas that were getting passed to us by partners that are individuals trying to get employment? Where's that kind of connection taking place?
There are levels, and I've noticed that too. It does seem like there are IT workers that like have zero hand in the APT game. They are there and that's pretty much what I would have to imagine a lot of them are. And then you have the ones that are like elevated, because some of them get different privileges. You see some that are like monitored every so many minutes. A image will be grabbed off of their computer, so that just to make sure that they're doing what they're doing. They might not have access to the outside internet, all stuff like that. I also see IT workers that are doing like all kinds of just like privileged stuff, and I'm like, okay, you two clearly are not the same. Like there is a differentiating. But I think a good example of that would be, even if you go back to our blog, the Assess North Korean Structure that we put out in October of last year, we kind of slipped something in there that I don't think a lot of people caught on to, and it is like the famous Park Jin Haw, that famous, the one you think of when you think of the indictments. You see his picture on there.
Yeah, talk about this a little bit, because I think this is gives you a little bit of a peek into what this kind of potentially looks like.
Yeah. So this was an interesting one, because I wouldn't I wouldn't expect in 2023 to have any type of tie-in or any work where I'm referencing Park Jin Hyuk. Like this is something from yesteryear. I don't have to deal with this anymore. This guy. He was a part of WannaCry. He was one of the heavy hands in the artist formerly known as APT38, which we know has been kind of fractured and very crypto focused these days. He was a heavy hand in that unit. The FBI did a terrific job in the indictments that they wrote up for them coming out of that LA office. Just really, really great stuff. And they inside this indictments, they just put just everything, all the emails he was using, all just the entire wrap up, how they're doing all the Chosun Expo and his work on WannaCry, the work on Sony, the work on the Bangladesh. This guy has hands in everything. And that makes sense because this is like, going back into the Park Jin Hyuk and your APT operators, if you're one of those type of his level type, like they can do it all. And the stuff he was doing was just incredible on like a scale, like moving to crypto, moving to finance, moving to espionage, moving to destructive. He could, it was really, really interesting in how his skill set. But then when we started working with our partners and we started looking at some of the people that have a more heavy hand in the IT worker platforms, we started looking and they were seeing the same email addresses that were being put out in the indictments. They were seeing actually on use on some of these job sites for doing IT work. So there's confirmation that even after the Sony hack, at least Park Jin Hyuk was on job platforms conducting IT work. It wasn't until, and again, this is what we're hearing from our partners, it wasn't until the indictment came out and those emails came out, then they were dropped from the job platforms. So seeing him hop from all these different intrusion sets, hop on all these different activities and these efforts, these very global WannaCry, Sony, like these Bangladesh, these are huge like events that took place. And then it's like, oh, on the side, also I'm going to go make some money. I'm going to make some apps for XYZ Pokemon company or whatever you want to throw in. I'm going to also make some money on the side. So that is incredible, but also that's kind of like, okay, and again, another point to point out that they can hop from point to point, something we've been talking about over here at Mandiant, but now we're introducing the IT worker efforts into our global analysis on what we're seeing in North Korea.
So tying this all together, and again, as you mentioned, our understanding of North Korean cyber capability and operations have evolved over the years, as not just our understanding, but also the nature of those organizations and units as well has literally evolved over the years. With respect to kind of where we understand it now, and with our understanding about this sort of emerging threat of the IT workers, where do you see this going? How do you see this threat evolving going forward? Do you think this is going to be a bigger piece of, say, for example, the crypto or revenue generation focused operations from North Korean workers? Or is this something that we can expect to be leveraged more on the espionage side, right? Taking that insider access and handing that off to a group where that's their primary tasking is intel collection. How do you think this is all going to evolve going forward?
I think kind of that the evolution and kind of the outlook too for what we should be either doing or at least be in the know of. One, I think the fact that, again, this is a country that no one likes to touch because it is so odd and complicated. So one, if for those that didn't want to touch it, that maybe should have, like now might be the time to look into it because we're at this point right now where things haven't really popped off. On the global scale, we have the missile launches going. Again, this is something that the IT workers and a lot of the groups have directly funded. So it's like we're seeing, we might not always say IT workers, but whenever you see these launches and this development and these programs, it's a direct reflection of what's going on in the cyber space, along with many other things. I think knowledge is key here. I think one, we need to get to the point where we're understanding how great this threat is. This isn't just a terrible worker at your company that sometimes gets fired. We've seen that too. They have bad reviews sometimes on some of these sites. They don't do a very good job. This isn't just some schmo consulted remote hire that you're dealing with. It could be the placement and access that creates a greater problem. Again, not now, but in the future, because if we're already seeing, as far as like the weapon stages and the weapons development, we're getting to a point now where the threats from North Korea that we would always hear about and the saber rattling from yesteryear, they're a little bit more potent and believable now, because we are at that point where we're starting to test bigger and badder things and we know they're shooting for it. Also, now that we're starting to understand that APTs are a lot more involved in some of these operations that we previously didn't. I think the evolution and going forward, I think, is one, being able to identify and understand like the actual problem set. Two, trying to figure out the defenses. There's a lot of publications coming out on like, hey, whenever we're vetting, like regularly vetting your remote hires, or making sure that in some situations, if you contract something, you need to have something in your terms of service or statement of work that like, I need to make sure that everyone that's working for you actually is working for you, because I'm not about to get hacked because you had terrible hiring practices, stuff like that. I don't know the full where we're headed and what we're doing, but I do know that we're at the point now where we need to, again, pay a little more attention to North Korea, pay a little more attention to the one subset that already had a hard time tracking, which is going to be even harder. You know, got to eat our vegetables. It's going to suck, but we have to like pay attention to these guys because the threat is absolutely real.
So, and maybe that's a great point to end it on. But for organizations that, they've heard you talk about this now, and hopefully that they are awake to this problem, what are some things that they should be looking for? What are some pragmatic tips? Now they're like, okay, I'm concerned about this particular threat. Maybe my organization does use a lot of freelancer for parts of our development and engineering efforts. What are some things that they should be looking for when they are going out and potentially being exposed to hiring someone like a DPRK IT worker?
If there's ways to do sweeps of the client environment, that would be good, because again, a lot of times in what we've even seen on some of the public reporting, where you have people running laptop farms and stuff like that, where then they're remoting in, and from the remoting in, then they can get into whatever environment they're actually working in. Being able to scan your remote devices, and there's a lot of them because we live in this new remote world post pandemic, but being able to scan your remote devices to make sure that no one's remoting into those, I think would be a very, very big one. But ultimately, just doing better vetting, better hiring practices on making sure that everyone that says they're there is actually there. And also just the new usage of AI and your all the different type of language and generative models and stuff like that. The resumes are getting better, so being able to spot those and seeing like, hey, this work history does not line up. Hey, this is not that is getting better. So you can't always fall on that, but also just checking to make sure, maybe get these people on camera, get these people on actually asking, because they are hiring externals to sit in their place. But if you start asking them about the work that you've known and seen them do, then you can be like, okay, this is the guy. So just better vetting, and it's time, and it takes time to do, and it's not the greatest thing, but just for sake of security, I think it'd be an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I know we've seen that be successful at catching several suspected DPRK IT workers. Is just, part of the interview process, making sure that you're doing that over a video camera, and testing on some of those questions around their knowledge or background or skill set. So
Also locking some of that stuff down too. Like one of our people that we had worked with and talked to, working again at a crypto centric platform. Whenever they were determined, they didn't determine to be an IT worker at the time. They just knew that they were a bad remote worker and they needed to get them off the site. Immediately started trying to get into admin in places that they shouldn't have been, to actually blow up some of the crypto efforts from the inside. So again, if you have those remote ones, until they're properly vetted, being able to quarantine and contain them in case something like this definitely helped them, because they didn't have access to, the builds. But in situations like that, that definitely helped them, which, later on you find out it's an IT worker.
excellent. Well, Barney, always great to talk to you. I'm sure we'll have you back on probably sometime again this year, as you're continuing to do research, as well as everyone else who's focused on this particular problem set, and we watch it continue to evolve. But thanks for your time today. And oh yeah,
And just a special thanks to our team. I'm always the one up here talking to you, Luke, but we got some gangsters in there that really just they never get their name mentioned, but I just wanted to shout out to them.
definitely fantastic point to end it on. Barney, take care and have a great day.